Hello, Pilgrim friends and family. It's Mrs. Conniff, another summer reading activity about voting, because this is the 100th anniversary of the ratified 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And I just did one about Susan B. Anthony, and this one is about two women who went around the country encouraging people to register to vote, and it is called Around America to Win the Vote. Two suffragists, a kitten, and 10,000 Miles, published in 2016 by Candlewick Press and written by Mara Rockliff, illustrated by Hadley Hooper. That's our title page. Looks like a poster encouraging people to vote. On April 6, 1916, a little yellow car set out from New York City. It carried tools, spare parts, a teeny tiny typewriter, an itsy bitsy sewing machine, one stout leather trunk bursting with useful things, two smiling women, and a wee black kitten with a yellow ribbon tied around its neck. The taller woman was Nell Richardson, the smaller one was Alice Burke. Together they planned to drive all the way around America. It was a great big country, but they had a great big cause. Votes for women, Alice told reporters. Votes for women. Nell agreed. They said the typewriter and the sewing machine were all part of their plan. If anyone said women didn't have the brains to vote, then Nell would dash a poem off right then and there to prove they did. If anyone said they should cook and sew and leave running the nation to the men, then Nell would whip an apron up while Alice gave a speech to prove they could do both. And if the two of them could circle the United States, 10,000 bumpy, muddy, unmapped miles, facing danger and adventure all alone with just each other and a kitten in their little yellow car, well, that would prove that women could do anything. So off they went. That very day, they had their first adventure when a horse pulling a wagon down a narrow road refused to let them pass. Votes for women, Alice told the horse. Nell tied a Votes for Women yellow daffodil behind his ear. Then the horse stepped aside and let the little yellow car go on its way. In Philadelphia, they stood up on their seats to speak to the great city crowd. Nell didn't need to write a poem on her typewriter or sew an apron on her sewing machine. Men and women cheered. But the next morning, blizzard. Nell and Alice dug into their trunk of useful things. They put on their raincoats and their rubber hats and drove through howling wind and swirling snow to Baltimore. Where they arrived in time to be the guests of honour at a very fancy party. The trunk held a few useful things for parties, too. The next day, when they stopped for gas, a crowd of men clustered around the little yellow car. Alice hopped up on the seat to give her speech, but no one listened, so she told them all about the car instead. Votes for women, the men said, and waved as Nell and Alice drove away. After a quick visit to Washington, D.C., they came upon the bumpiest and muddiest road yet. The little yellow car went bump and squelch and finally got stuck. As the car sank, Nell and Alice jumped into the icy stream. They cranked and cranked and cranked the engine, but it wouldn't start. Votes for women, Nell reminded Alice cheeringly. Alice grumbled. And good roads. In the trunk they found a lantern and a blanket and a box of candy from their friends. They huddled wet and shivering under the blanket and ate candy till the sun came up and two strong mules appeared to pull their car out of the mud. In Virginia, Nell and Alice passed a school and all the children ran to see the little yellow car. They hung all over it and wouldn't let the women or the kitten go till Alice promised to send them a picture postcard from someplace extremely far away. They drove into North Carolina, passing fields of singing birds and butterflies and goldenrod. And nearly fell into a hole where a bridge used to be. Next came deep puddles, sticky clay, and thick, wet sand. In South Carolina, a whole town turned out and treated them to an all-yellow lunch. In Georgia, they joined a circus parade. In Alabama, the two travellers sipped tea and nibbled on stuffed dates. Everywhere they met crowds, everywhere, Nell and Alice told them, V for W. Outside Gulfport, Mississippi, the little yellow car finally found a mud puddle it couldn't cross. They sneaked the kitten onto the train. And smuggled it into a fine hotel in New Orleans. Then the little car arrived, and they were on their way. They dodged bullets by the Rio Grande, drove on through the desert of New Mexico, and got lost for days in Arizona, until finally they reached California, where they won a medal at the fair for driving a long way to get there, all the way across America. But they were only halfway to the finish line. They still had lots of miles and lots of adventures on the road ahead. So a map of where they've been and where they still have to go. On September 30th, 1916, a little yellow car drove into New York City. It carried mud and dust and signatures and souvenirs from all around America. 2 smiling and sunburned women and a full-grown cat. They arrived to a grand welcome. And a great big yellow cake. The cat ate 7 slices, as reported in the next morning's Tribune. After 10,000 bumpy, muddy, unmapped miles, Nell was ready for a rest. And Alice? She turned right around and crossed the country all over again. This time, she took the train. So remember what it said that it was 1916 that they arrived in New York, and this the 4 years later was when it happened. There's some interesting back matter, so I'm going to read it. If you'd like to stay tuned for it, it's always important to read a bit more information, and that's what we'll do. I'm going to read about the voting part, not about the car. Alice and Nell's journey may sound long and hard, but it was quick and easy compared to the journey American women undertook to win the vote. In 1776, future First Lady Abigail Adams wrote to her revolutionary husband, John, urging him to remember the ladies. She said that if American men were willing to fight for independence and a say in their own government, so were American women. John Adams wrote back, "I cannot but laugh. Soon after, he signed the Declaration of Independence, which stated that all men are created equal. Women were left out. In 1848, a group of women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, held a meeting at Seneca Falls, New York. There they signed their own declaration, stating that all men and women are created equal, but to make women equal under the law, they knew they had to win the right to vote. 72 years had passed since Abigail Adams spoke up for women's rights. It would take exactly 72 more to reach her goal. The women and some men who fought this battle were called suffragists. Suffrage means the right to vote. Along with Mott and Stanton, they included leaders such as Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Alice Paul, and Ida B. Wells. They also included hundreds of thousands of lesser-known heroes like Nell Richardson and Alice Burke. These women defied husbands and fathers to march in the streets and make speeches. Every night for 6 months, Alice stood on a wooden soapbox at the corner of Broadway and 96th Street in New York City, cheerfully haranguing passers-by. As the years went by, the suffragists got creative. They wrote songs, they drew cartoons. One pilot suffragist bombed carnival crowds with leaflets from a plane. Another, hoping to reach coal miners, wore overalls and went down 2,500 feet below the ground. Suffragists even made the Statue of Liberty speak. The words that came out of its mouth, of course, were votes for women. The year 1916 was an exciting one. Jeanette Rankin of Montana, one of the 11 western states where women had the vote, became the first woman elected to Congress. It was an election year for the President of the United States as well, and suffragists planned huge demonstrations to persuade both sides to give women the vote. At the Republican Convention in Chicago, thousands of women and girls marched in the freezing rain behind a baby elephant draped in a rubber blanket that said, "Votes for Women." The next week in St. Louis, they held a walkless parade. Men on their way to the Democratic Convention had to pass between 8,000 silent suffragists lining the streets for a mile on both sides. Well, that would be a pretty impressive thing, wouldn't it? That's an interesting way to quietly demonstrate. These demonstrators came from all over the country. Many must have heard about the plans from Nell and Alice, who used their cross-country trip to spread the word. At the time of the conventions, the pair had just arrived in California, but they didn't stop. They knew their work was not yet done. The next year, the United States entered World War I. Many suffragists set aside their own goals to help with the war effort. Others, led by Alice Paul, kept up the fight. They picketed the White House, asking Woodrow Wilson why democracy abroad was more important than democracy at home. Mobs attacked the peaceful protesters, while police stood by and watched. Then the police began arresting suffragists who hadn't broken any law. In prison, the women were treated so badly and resisted so bravely that public opinion turned. Americans demanded votes for women now. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially added to the U.S. Constitution. It states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." At last, American women had won the right to vote. Why all the yellow? The colour yellow stood for votes for women everywhere in the United States. And now we're sporting a pink hat to help demonstrate solidarity and equality for women. This is about the car. That newfangled machine. In the early 1900s, only the very adventurous would even try to drive across America. The first to succeed was a Vermont doctor named H. Nelson Jackson, who drove from California to New York in 1903. 6 years later, Alice Ramsey of New Jersey became the first woman to finish the cross-country trip. Neither of them traveled half as far as Alice Burke and Nell Richardson would in 1916, driving all day and making public speeches every night. By 1916, automobiles had become quite popular, but driving was still a challenge. Gas stations weren't common yet, so Nell and Alice would have stopped at country stores or farms to fill their tank. Instead of road maps, they had to rely on the Blue Book, which gave directions like turn right at the yellow barn. Not so helpful if the barn had fallen down or been repainted red. Nell and Alice drove a little runabout made by the Saxon Motor Car Company. They called it the Golden Flyer. Before they left New York, it was officially christened by suffrage leader Carrie Chapman Catt, using a champagne bottle filled with gasoline. Newspapers reported that Catt brought the bottle down so hard she left the radiator with a dent. Alice also called the car their yellow baby and bragged about how well it ran. The little baby motor car has been true to us, she wrote. We can't blame her when she gets stuck in the mud. They even named the kitten Saxon. In turn, the Saxon company used Nell and Alice in an ad. Like many ads, it stretched the truth, claiming that the two travellers sped easily from one place to the next and were never late once. Yesterday, we went up slowly toward a white mule that was drawing a long wagon, and he seemed perfectly serene, when suddenly he turned to his right and jumped wildly over a 5-foot embankment. For an instant, we had a vision of the old white mule with his ears laid back flat, his tail flying out straight behind, and a long, thin wagon in the air. Then mule, wagon, and driver struck ground right side up, and with no damage done except to the King's English, which suffered a bit when the driver told the mule just what he thought of him. Alice S. Burke, Diary of the Golden Flyer, Boston Globe, April 22nd, 1916. Okay, so that was around America to win the vote. We learned a little bit about the colour yellow and how hard it was for those ladies and how dedicated they were to follow on Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's good work. All right, thank you for listening in. That was a long one, but there was a lot of good information in there. Hopefully you took a break if you needed it.